The UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, where the UCLA campus lies today. We also recognize that the UCLA Lake Arrowhead Conference Center sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Uhaviatam people. We would like to thank the sponsors of the 2020 UCLA Arrowhead Symposium online series. Their support enables us to bring you today's program. Thank you to WSP for supporting this session. This is an interactive session. To participate in this session, use Zoom's built-in chat, Q&A, and raise hand features.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone that is here that is joining us for Impacts of California's Transportation Finance. So my name is Chanel Fletcher, and I am the Executive Director of Climate Plan. For those who don't know, Climate Plan, we are a statewide network of nonprofit organizations, and we have been working at the intersection of land use, transportation, housing, and climate for, I think, or since 2009, actually since 2007. So I joined in 2009, we've started since 2007. I am so excited to be here today, and you can see all of our speakers on the screen, but with Aisha Weinstein, who's the director at Mineta Transportation Institute, with Therese McMillan, the executive director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and Hillary Norton, who is the chair of the California Transportation Commission, as well as the executive director of Fastlink DTLA. We are going to have a very rich conversation where we're going to be talking about the impacts on transportation finance. And I'm sure as you guys have read the description, what we're looking at and what we're seeing right now is really, there has been a huge reduction in travel and just economic activity that's come from this global pandemic, COVID-19. And we're also seeing reduced revenues coming from the motor vehicle fuel tax, toll bridges, transit fares, taxis, TNCs, and our sales taxes. And so really today what we're going to do is all of these speakers who have a wealth of knowledge are really going to talk about what we can expect to see kind of currently and future impacts in terms of transportation expenditures on both operation and capital, as well as the financial viability of transportation agencies. I think as we saw on the slide before, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. If you have conversation that you want to have while we're having this conversation and having this dialogue, please use the chat feature. And I think I wanted to just say a couple of just like kind of framing remarks in addition to that summary that we've seen in the on the materials that we've sent out. One of the things that I really wanted to kind of just make sure that we're very clear about is that right now we are in a moment, and the moment can be interpreted in multiple ways, but the way that I see it, kind of from my understanding, we're looking at one, we are in a global pandemic, as I mentioned before. COVID-19 has changed the way that we live, that we are experiencing. I mean, the fact that we are all not at Lake Arrowhead right now, and as a matter of fact, we are doing this virtual by Zoom. In some ways, it has increased, I think, who can participate, who can come to the table, but in other ways, right? I mean, a lot of those kind of like armchair conversations, the way that we used to connect and find somebody and talk to them, that's completely different, right? And I mean, we're seeing it not just in terms of this conference, but in terms of who's riding transit, who gets the choice not to, how are we moving, how are we accessed, where are we not moving, and what does that mean for our economy and for jobs? In addition to, I think, what we're seeing with the global pandemic, climate change, right? We are in a climate crisis. California is on fire. I live in the Bay Area on Ohlone land, and I can't tell you how many times I've had to talk to my two little ones and just explain why there's smoke in the air, where these wildfires are at, why they're happening. And we know why, right? There's a lot of different things that go into it, but at the root of it is climate change. We are seeing the climate change before our very eyes. How does transportation play into that? How is it impacted by that? That is something huge that we are thinking about and that we want to talk about and acknowledge. One of the last things that I wanted to bring up, I talked about this moment, but we can't ignore is the fact that we are in a racial reckoning. And I mean, I almost just want to pause in saying that, because as a Black woman, it's never not been that for me. Like, right? Like I embody and hear and feel what it is to be Black, what it means to have access, what it means to have mobility and to not have mobility. So I've always felt that. But now, I mean, we're seeing it with like the Black Lives Matters movement. We're seeing it with the murder of George Floyd. But there was a whole list of people before. But at this moment right now, we are talking about, defunding the police. We're having these very big conversations, and we just had a panel on Monday where we were talking about, we need like reparations. We need to think about this from transportation, which I think has a lot of roots in terms of like when we're talking about racism and racial reckoning. And even when we're talking about the murders that are happening, they're happening in these like public transportation spaces. So this is a lot. This is a lot that we are coming to this conversation with, that we are bringing with us. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. And that when we're talking about transportation finance, it's important that we understand what are the impacts that we are seeing in terms of the investment, in terms of the funding, what is happening right now, what can happen in the future, what is possible. And so I'm really excited to be on an all-female panel, as has been noted in the chat. I mean, that's something in and of itself, is just seeing all of these brilliant and amazing women that I get to share this panel with, to be talking about these issues, to be grappling with them, and to talk about them in meaningful ways. And so I think the thing that I would urge folks in the chat, that I'm going to urge all of our speakers to talk about, is let's not shy away from the hard conversations, from the difficult conversations, from the things that we've heard throughout this week. Like let's embrace that. Let's lean in. Let's have those real conversations. And let's really think through and just be transparent and honest in terms of, hey, well, this is what we're seeing happening. This is what we're seeing that we can't happen, but we want to brainstorm and think about, like, let's kind of just basically bring it to the table, be transparent and be honest. And with that said, I am going to turn it over to Therese. As I mentioned, and she's going to share more about her background and how she comes to this work. But in addition to being the executive director at MTC, and I'm going to use an acronym, but I will call out myself for doing that and say it's shorthand for Metropolitan Transportation Commission. In addition to that work, she also comes to us having worked at the federal level, as the acting administrator of the Federal Transit Administration under President Obama, as well as, for folks that are down south in Southern California, you also probably know her from her work at LA Metro in terms of what she spearheaded there. So I'm going to turn it over to her. She's going to give some opening remarks talking about, again, those impacts that we're seeing. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Therese.
Chanel, thank you so much. And it's a delight to be here, to be a part of completely reframed and different Arrowhead, and one that, again, I'm both excited and humbled to be a part of, and particularly with this wonderful panel of women I'm with. As we open this session on the future of transportation funding, in the wake of COVID-19 and the very abnormal state of affairs on many levels, as Chanel pointed out so eloquently, we really need to appreciate and take a bit of a deeper dive on the uniqueness of this point in time, and particularly compared to others where in the past, where we've experienced economic impacts to transportation, travel, and investments. Critically, and again, the driving and essential message of this conference that we can't say enough, we need to recognize, accept, and be accountable to the intersections of the crises before us: an unprecedented pandemic, long-standing racial and economic disparities laid painfully bare by that pandemic, and the social reckoning demanded by that reality. And then the climate change impacts that in many ways, I believe, underscore and has driven the severity of the crises of our times. So that's a lot as background, and to then reflect on how that all redounds to transportation funding, which is a focus of this panel, I wanted to take a moment to perhaps frame up for us how the pandemic impacted transportation, and especially I'll be referring to public transit, how it affected the use of those systems in unprecedented ways compared to other crises. The COVID-19 pandemic is far-flung instead of being localized in terms of geography. So contrasting to floods or fire, hurricanes, a terrorist attack, this is across the country and across the globe. It came to us swiftly and suddenly in terms of its impact on transportation in this country, but it was a result of deliberate policy-generated decisions, the imposition of shelter in place, where literally one day folks were told, go home and stay home. And that was quite different compared to other economic recessions and downturns that would have dampened travel, but not in such a seismically, immediate fashion. The impact was and continues to be very concentrated on operations, not infrastructure for now. So again, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy destroyed transportation infrastructure, and that was very defining in terms of how we needed to react. But this has been really about using the system and how it's operated, which is quite different. And there's no clear idea of when this pandemic is going to be over. And so pinning down recovery and how we can begin to do that is continuing to shift. So here's some perspective on those factors and how they have impacted transportation revenues. On the upside, similar to past emergencies, we saw an infusion of emergency resources from the federal government, and this was the CARES Act in this case. Now, that type of federal emergency in major disasters is fairly typical, but unfortunately, the lack of boundaries to this pandemic makes the scale and effect of those emergency dollars, which were in the billions, mind you, frankly, they're still limited because the crisis is still going on. And so we're beginning to get a handle on that challenge. As an example, for our San Francisco Bay Area transit operators, the CARES Act was essential in slowing down the approach to a financial cliff. But now we are looking over the edge of that cliff. Absent additional infusions of significant assistance, further assistance from the federal or state government, we're expecting in our region across all our transit operators collectively a shortfall of $400 to $600 million by the end of this fiscal year, and upwards of $1.7 billion for the next fiscal year if things weren't foundationally to change. In the wake of a hurricane or a fire or other natural disaster, there is a period of assessing the damage and then scaling emergency funding to address that damage. Now, that is not perfect. Believe me, I worked with FEMA when I was at the FTA very deeply. But you do sort of have some baseline for figuring out how you start to rebuild. However, the damage in the face of this pandemic is sort of a remarkable flip, because as I mentioned before, it is impacting the operating environment, and it is bringing forward a really different set of questions we have to deal with. How do you provide transportation services that protect the public's health? That is a very different question than we've had in the past. How do we win back traveler confidence? We're all grappling with the question, particularly in public transit, when and how is it safe to come back to public transit or to take airplanes, again, in a different modal context? There's a question of, do we cut back travel, period? Telecommuting has become an increasingly visible And I would say, certainly in the Bay Area recently, an increasingly contentious issue as we've all lived through a living lab of remote work, and in many ways have realized that it works well in certain circumstances and not so well in a number of different circumstances, and particularly for our frontline workers and particularly for our historically underserved communities where the very infrastructure for working with remote work is non-existent or very, very slim. So revenue sources are reacting directly to this public health uncertainty. Transit fares, tolls, sales and use taxes, fuel taxes. One exception, again, to date, was there's been a stability in federal formula grants and the like, so that's been a good thing. But we have seen immediate revenue reductions. We are expecting rebounds to various degrees, but as you will hear in the presentation today, an enduring lesson is that until the pandemic and the economic rebuilding around it really stabilizes, revenues are going to be uncertain and financial scenario planning will be essential. Budgets will need to be flexible. A diversified portfolio of revenues is probably a good bet as a lesson learned out of this. And the very best thing we can do is try to build flexibility into the use of the revenues that we have and that we might get. And let me end with this. Most importantly, we must ask the questions of how and for whom will current and future transportation dollars be spent. The challenge presented at this conference of infrastructure reparation investment that was brought forward in the opening session strikes directly at the heart of the question. As we rebuild financially from this crisis, are we going to recreate the deep disparities that existed prior to it in terms of the provision and the operation and affordability of our transportation services? And if we don't want to follow that trajectory again, how do we change it with intentional action? So those are my comments to open up. What I would like to do now is introduce Hillary Norton. Hillary is a good friend, and I met her when I was working at LA Metro, and I was so impressed with her passion and with her deep commitment to dealing with the transportation challenges in the greater Los Angeles area. As was mentioned, she is currently the executive director of Fastlink Downtown LA, which is a new transportation management organization in the downtown area, operating one of the first ever micro transit systems connecting travelers through multimodal apps, on-demand wheelchair accessible vehicles, a number of elements of the innovative way we need to approach transportation and mobility and making it available and workable for everyone. She has a long history of working with the business community. She served in 2018 as chairwoman of the Los Angeles County Business Federation, or BizFed, and is on the board of directors of the Central City Association. She co-chairs transportation committees for both of those organizations. And most impressively, and we always, I'm always inspired by women stepping into meaningful decision-making positions in transportation. Hillary was appointed by Governor Newsom to the California Transportation Commission in September of 2019, and her peers, fellow commissioners, elected her to be vice chair in February of 2020 and subsequently chair in August of 2020. So with that, let me hand it over to Hillary. And again, thank you all for participating and your interest in the subject.
Thank you very much, Therese. And for everyone who is listening, it is so important that a brilliant Black woman like Therese McMillan leads every panel, because her framing and frankly, the work she did when she was at Metro to begin the equity conversation, the foundation that she laid is something that we are all appreciative of. And she did so with people who are likely on this call and listening to this panel, like Jessica Meany and Keandra Dodds. And I just thank you that women like you are just killing it all over the place and identifying these needs in this profound way. I also want to say that as chair of the California Transportation Commission, that I also stand on the shoulders of many people at UCLA that were part of a really important study that was funded by the chair of my board at FAST, Jim Thomas, who many people do not know is a Native American Lumbee Indian from North Carolina, who invested in a RAND report that was called Moving Los Angeles, Short-Term Policy Options for Improving Transportation. Dr. Marty Wax, Paul Sorensen, Allison Yeoh, Brian Taylor, Donald Shoup, and Juan Matute were part of that study. And the fact that we are able to talk about congestion pricing, bus rapid transit, express lanes is part of that legacy of that study that came out in 2008 that we have been working on all this time. And I just want to thank you for the courage of adding this to the conversation and making sure that we were part of implementing all of these opportunities for transportation funding that is very, very new. I'm delighted as part of the California Transportation Commission, not only to see transportation from the 30,000 foot level at the CTC, but also at the 1 foot level, as we are talking with the business community about private sector investment in transportation and understanding the value of moving people to and from localities. In fact, cities like Seattle have 60% of their transportation transit fees paid by the private sector, business sector. And we want to see more of that investment from the private sector as we talk about the opportunities to fund things differently. I want to lay out for you some information about SB1, which is the primary focus of the California Transportation Commission. It was part of Senator Bell's legislation, and his goal was to create both a fix-it-first strategy for our roads, but also a jobs program, and that has been very, very effective. And so, Juan, if you could put back up the slide about how those funds are distributed. I want to talk to you about the fact that we fund many types of transportation projects: highway, road, intercity rail, transit, bicycle, pedestrian, et cetera, through different programs. And state law determines how much funding goes to each type of program and the overall program purpose. There are also constitutional restrictions on the use of funds. The CTC itself doesn't plan or develop projects, but we work closely with Caltrans and local regional agencies to fund projects that come to us where we have talked about the goals we want to achieve. And we're usually the last stop for funding, but by creating the guidelines, we help move the agenda by showing the kind of projects we want to see submitted. And I'm very proud to say that under the time that I have been there as commissioner, that this year Caltrans committed to setting aside $100 million of the state highway funds for Complete Streets projects standalone, but have also committed that every single highway project that is funded through that SHOP program is going to have Complete Streets elements included. I'm also delighted that even as I was interim chair in June, that we moved forward with community leaders like Chanel to start an equity roundtable and equity listening sessions in partnership with CalSTA and Caltrans. These equity listening sessions are not hearings, and this is why. We do not have to prove that inequities and systematic disinvestment exists in the transportation system. What we are here to do is listen to how those inequities and systematic disinvestment has been felt in communities and what needs to be done to address those inequities. This partnership which is really unprecedented with CalSTA, Caltrans, CTC, and the community, is going to be, we believe, precedent setting, because as goes California, so goes the nation. Our goal is to be purposeful, but also permanent, and to work with the new legislation on reparations, which we'll discuss later, to make this investment as meaningful as possible. We are not stopping with just transportation investments, though. We are also talking about hiring within the agencies and the value of contracting with companies that are owned by the Black community and other communities. It is so important that Prop 16 passes, where we can start addressing wrongs of inequities in contracting as well, because it isn't just important to have community be stakeholders. We want the community to be a stockholder. We don't want just community benefits, we want community dividends, and that means permanent investment. We also want to look at how we can partner these investments with enhanced infrastructure finance districts and tax increment financing, so that we can have permanent sources of funding that can address some of the other issues related to transportation displacement, such as access to affordable housing and access to other economic opportunities and broadband. We'll move to other conversations in the panel. And before we do that, I would like to introduce Dr. Asha Weinstein Agrawal, who's professor of urban and regional planning at San Jose State University and the director of the Mineta Transportation Institute. Her research agenda is guided by a commitment to the principles of sustainability and equity. What planning and policy tools can communities adopt to encourage environmentally friendly travel and improve accessibility for people struggling with poverty or other disadvantages? She's explored this question most deeply through two substantive areas: transportation finance policy and the travel behavior of pedestrians, cyclists, and transit riders. Dr. Agrawal also works in the area of urban history and is currently chair of the Transportation Research Board's subcommittee on transportation history. She's been invited to share her research findings at events such as briefing sessions for staff of the US Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works, and a meeting of the California Road Charge Pilot Program Technical Advisory Committee, which the CTC also has a seat on, with Dr. Joe Liu, Transportation Commissioner, and an informal hearing for subcommittee of the California State Senate Committees on Housing and Transportation. Dr. Agrawal earned a BA from Harvard University in Folklore and Mythology, an MSc from the London School of Economics and Political Science in Urban and Regional Planning, and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in City and Regional Planning. Dr. Agrawal.
And I will just mention that I'm not able to start my video, so hopefully our technical staff can fix that. Good morning to everyone. I'd like to thank the Arrowhead conference organizers for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel, and also Hillary for her very kind introduction, and just jump right into what I'm going to be sharing today, which is a little bit different, but also builds on what you've heard from both Therese and Hillary and Chanel so far. So I have been engaged in a research project looking at the long-term impacts that COVID-19 might have on California's state transportation revenue. And by that, I mean the revenue that the state itself collects through its own taxes and fees. And we have used a scenario analysis to try and imagine what the future might bring. So I want to acknowledge, by the way, that this project, I have 3 co-authors, Hannah King, Martin Wax, and Jeremy Marks. And a particular thank you to Marty Wax, because I worked for him more than 20 years ago as a research assistant on a transportation revenue funding finance project. And clearly it must have meant something interesting to me, because here I am all these years later. Also, the Mineta Transportation Institute has very generously funded this work. So the question that my collaborators and I set out to ask for was, how might COVID-19 affect the state-generated transportation revenues through 2040? And It's actually a pretty long and somewhat convoluted discussion about how we get there. So I'm actually going to just show our results quickly first, so you have a little sense of what I'm talking about, and then I'll backtrack through what we did, how we got here, and what this might all mean. But we put together 6 hypothetical scenarios of how the economy might recover from COVID, and also different trajectories in terms of electric vehicle penetration and sort of annual mileage per person and things like that. So each of these lines is one of those, and again, I stress these are hypothetical scenarios that we put together, showing total revenue that the state would be generating from its taxes and fees through 2040. And as you can see, there's quite a wide variation. So let me now backtrack and explain to you how we got there. So first of all, the taxes and fees that we are projecting, I'm calling the SB1 package. And this is a combination both of taxes on fuels, which are paid when you purchase fuel, and then taxes, annual fees on vehicles. So in terms of the fuel taxes, there's an excise tax on gasoline, and then for diesel, there's both an excise tax and a sales tax. And
Hey,
then in
Asha,
terms of,
sorry,
yes.
it doesn't look like we see your screen share.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. I was so concerned about getting myself visible that I forgot about the slides.
There we go.
Is this working? Okay, so let me just quickly go backtrack because this is most important. So these are this figure I was showing with the scenarios that I'm going to be talking through. And as you can see, there are these different trajectories. Each of these different colored lines is a different one of our scenarios. So, and then we were looking at this mix of fuel taxes and annual vehicle fees. And I'll just mention one of these annual fees, the Transportation Improvement Fee, or TIF, is on every light duty vehicle, and it depends on the vehicle value. And then there's the road improvement fee, which is only on zero emission vehicles, and it's starting at $100 a year. The SB1 legislation has a framework for increasing all of these over time. So what did we do? So we were projecting this package of taxes I just showed you. And we used spreadsheet models and readily available data. So for example, for something like diesel fuel prices, we would look to the US EIA Energy Information Administration. And then what we did was we developed 6 hypothetical COVID-19 recovery scenarios. And let me talk through now a little bit about those scenarios. So these were designed to reflect a range of possible futures. And I want to stress, we don't know that any one of these is particularly likely to happen. So we quite deliberately tried to construct scenarios that vary a good deal, kind of push the envelope a little bit in terms of things like VMT or fleet size, but to cover a wide range of things. And so to construct the scenarios, we kept a lot of other inputs into our models constant across the scenarios, but then we varied 5 of them. And I'm going to talk through these 5 a little bit more. But the next slide is overwhelming. So before I get there, I'll just say it's annual state VMT, light duty vehicle fleet size, the light duty ZEV fleet size, the light duty ZEV vehicle values, and then heavy duty diesel fleet size. So I know no one is going to read this table. Please don't even try. The slides will obviously be available later, but I'm just showing conceptually. So the rows are those different inputs that we varied for different scenarios. And then we created these 3 trajectories, these 3 possible futures for each of those input variables. And we call them high, medium, and low. And just to give you an example, again, I'm not going to talk through the whole thing, annual state VMT. This was a variable that we imagined in some ways most directly tracking the COVID recovery. So in our high scenario, the VMT we predict, or not predict, we constructed a scenario that says VMT would reach 90% of pre-COVID levels by January 21, and then continue increasing and being back at sort of pre-COVID levels by January 2022, and then sort of continue on. In the low scenario, on the other hand, we predicted that VMT remains at sort of current August 2020 levels until March of 2025. So a very long period where we're just kind of more static. And then by 2030 would be back to 90% of pre-COVID levels, and then sort of stay at 90% of what we would have projected for pre-COVID VMT. So the low scenario has this very, very slow creep back, and then we never quite reach where we would have been without COVID. And so this just gives you kind of a flavor of what we mean by these high, medium, and low scenarios. So the next slide is showing you, and again, I know it's confusing, so don't worry too much about the details, but we have the columns are those input variables that we're changing, high, medium, and low. And then the rows here are the 6 scenarios that we constructed, not very creatively named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so for each of these scenarios, we made a choice. Are we going to use our low, medium, or high trajectory for that input variable? So I'm going to talk today primarily just about number 1 and number 6, which are the extremes and kind of bound what we found. So scenario 1, which we've as a shortcut called our high carbon scenario, has high VMT, a large fleet of light duty vehicles, and quite a relatively low penetration of electric vehicles. So we have a big fleet, and most of them are not electric. They're running on gas or diesel fuel. So that's the one I just talked about. Then the other one I'll talk about, number 6 at the bottom, which is sort of the other bound of our scenarios, we called the low carbon scenario. And here we imagine quite low annual state VMT compared to what many of us might predict, a relatively small overall fleet of light duty vehicles, and then quite high penetration of zero emission vehicles. So then this brings me back to that slide that I thought I had showed you all in the beginning. Unfortunately, wasn't up in front of you. So this is what the state would collect if we added up the revenue from all of those different taxes, looking from 2020 to 2040 and for the different scenarios. And these are inflation adjusted dollars. So I'll make just a couple of observations. One is that the range of projected revenue in 2040, sort of looking all the way out, varies greatly from a low of 6.5 billion for that low carbon scenario, number 6, the black line at the bottom, all the way up to 10.9 billion for the high carbon scenario, which is the gold line at the top. And even if we just look out to 2025, so the sort of more imaginable future, there's still quite a large variation between the values for the top and bottom lines. Now, another thing I just want to mention is we also thought about, well, what would the cumulative revenue that the state would raise from 2020 through 2040 be under these different scenarios? And it ranges, again, greatly from 153 billion in our low carbon scenario up to 195 billion in the high carbon scenario. Now, the total revenue by source is something else that we thought it would be interesting to look at. So each of these little graphs is one of the scenarios, and the y-axis is 100%. So of all the revenue that's raised in that particular year, what percentage of it is coming from these different vehicle fees and fuel taxes? So the goldy orange colors that are on the top are the 2 different vehicle fees, and then the 3 different bluish colors towards the bottom are the different fuel taxes. Quickly, just a few things to notice. Taxes on fuels currently generate roughly 75% of total revenue, but that falls considerably in every scenario. Secondly, the gas excise tax raises far more revenue than even the 2 combined taxes on diesel fuel. Thirdly, those fees on vehicles, so that's the RIF and the TIF, grow greatly in importance over time. And by 2033 to 2035, so roughly 15 years from now, in all except our high carbon scenario, those vehicle fees are generating more than 50% of the revenue raised. Next point is that the TIF, which is the transportation improvement fee that all vehicles pay on light duty, generates considerably more revenue than the RIF. And indeed, by 2040, just the TIF could potentially be generating 50% of the revenue. So just to wrap up, and also I want to bring it back a little bit to equity now. So these projections show an enormously wide range of futures. And again, we don't know which, if any of these are going to happen, but it gives us thought about, different things we might want to be planning for. Second point is to realize that the fleet composition, both its size and the proportion of zero emission and ICE vehicles, has a major impact. And this shows up both in the amount of fuel tax raised, but also in the vehicle fee money raised. And then finally, as we look at it, this figure, and we see this great divergence, the state may want to change this package of taxes and fees to raise a different amount of revenue, or of course to find a more equitable way to raise revenue. And I'll just mention one of the things that the state, in a sort of long-term context is thinking about is mileage fees. And perhaps as a way to replace the gas and diesel excise taxes. And so just to throw out one sort of, again, we can use this set of models to imagine different ways we could raise revenue. So if we found ourselves with the size of fleet and the fleet composition and the miles driven of that bottom scenario, number 6, where right now we're not raising much revenue by 2040 comparatively. And we thought that's the vehicles we have and how much they're driving. And we actually decide we need to raise the amount of revenue that you see in that scenario number 1, the top line. In 2040, if we replaced all the fees that light duty vehicles are paying, so both the annual fee and the gas excise fee, it would be about 3.3 cents per mile for a mileage fee to get us the amount of revenue that we see in that highest revenue scenario. So again, I'm not saying this is what we want to do or should do, but it's an option. And there are many options that we as a state will doubtless be looking at. And because we're probably going to need to make some changes, I don't know, but it seems likely, certainly over 20 years, then we have this opportunity to think about, well, what's the right way to raise that revenue? And there are, major equity differences between these different taxes and fees. And just to end, I'll mention a couple small things. One is that the annual vehicle fees do not vary by how much you use your vehicle. So someone who maybe has a low income and an old vehicle and only can drive it a very small amount is going to be paying as much in that vehicle fee as someone who's driving, that same vehicle type, but a lot of miles. And then also the annual fees are something that for now, at least, you have to pay all at once. And so for lower income families, paying 100 or whatever dollars at one time can be much more challenging than paying that same amount of money over the course of a year, but in little tiny bits, as in every time you bought fuel or charged an electric vehicle. So with that, let me stop my screen sharing so we can return to the conversation.
Thank you, Aisha, so much. Asha, oh my gosh, I have a friend named Aisha, and so I always do that. And I swap them in my head, and I was like, oh, don't do that other.
Not a problem.
And then of course I did it now. Thank you so much. And I think I want to encourage now kind of all of our panelists to turn on their videos because we're moving into Q&A. And I want to say thank you to folks already for putting some answers in the Q&A, or questions, not answers, putting questions in the Q&A. I know that I've been looking at them, and to use the vernacular, what I will say is that these questions are fire. And if you guys don't know that vernacular term, it just means that I'm really excited for our panelists to dig into some of what we're talking about. And Hillary, if you can turn on your video, that'd be awesome. And if there's any technical issues,
the host needs to turn on my video. I was just gonna email that. If the host could turn on my video, that'd be great. Thank you.
Awesome, yay! Everybody, we can see everybody. Okay, so I only have 2 questions. And like I said, I want to get into these questions that I think folks have asked of folks. And so I know just so folks know, Jacob is going to be handling the Q&A part. So my 2 questions, I think the first one is that, we've talked and heard, I think, from Therese and from Hillary, from Asha as well, about the pandemic in terms of basically how unprecedented this is, right? So it's like nobody has expected it, and we haven't ever dealt with something like this before. And I loved when Therese was talking about, there's a hurricane, there's a tornado, like, there are these things, right? And you're kind of like, okay, like, here's how we can plan for it. And there's some sense of like, here's what recovery will look like. This is so completely different from that. And so I think, as we see the kind of pandemic continuing and we don't necessarily see things that are going to signal an end, I think, anytime soon, there was a question for me, and I think this really relates to the presentation that we just heard about, should we be kind of rethinking about how we're funding transportation, particularly as we're talking about some of those shortfalls and the cuts that we've seen? Should we be rethinking that is one question. And then the second question, if so, I think just based on your guys' experience, are there recommendations that you would give specifically around both, I think, around like revenue and around like programs? And so I think what I'll do is I'll have Therese start, and then we'll go to Hillary, and then we'll end with Asha.
Thanks so much, Janelle. And boy, that is a huge question that we've been grappling with. And I think I'd like to just point out maybe 4 different layers, because I don't think there's an answer, but I want to highlight considerations that have to be in place. One has to be, again, who is it that we're trying to serve? Who is it that we are trying to invest in? And that becomes really critical on a number of levels in terms of affordability. Asha was pointing out, the actual impacts that certain revenue streams have on you, depending if you're lower income or higher income. Another thing that is really challenging, and I'll just use the Bay Area as an example, a number of the funding sources that greatly underwrite transportation is sales and use, sales taxes and use taxes, right? General sales tax, like there's a half-cent sales tax that's dedicated to transportation. But those are exactly the same revenues that, for example, may have to tap into affordable housing or dealing with homelessness or underwriting education. So many of the sources we have to go to that have traditionally been used for transportation, and in this crisis, I have to say half of my job is also as the executive director of the Association of Bay Area Governments, where housing is an affordability, is just a huge equity issue. So this competition to use certain fund sources for varying demands is also something we're going to really have to get our heads around. And I think the other thing that is really important about this pandemic is resetting our expectations. And this is really hard particularly on a political as well as technical level. I would say that many of us back in March and April hoped and thought that we would be through this crisis by the end of the summer. And a lot of the assistance packages that were put together, I mean, kudos to Congress, led by Speaker Pelosi, to pull together the CARES Act with scales necessarily on certain assumptions about how long it will last. And now we're all realizing this is just going on a heck of a lot further. So I think we need to really think, and this is a hard conversation, and how do we perhaps have to recalibrate to a different level of stability that wasn't what it was like pre-pandemic? We might have to stabilize lower so that we can sustain it instead of lurching from financial cliff to financial cliff to financial cliff. So those are just some of the particular challenges I think we need to deal with to your question of how we reassess financing, and I'll stop there.
Well, I think this is a great question, and a few things that I would say. We really need to make sure that the federal government does its part, and Therese highlighted this very appropriately, and it's a big concern at the CTC that we are working with the legislative framework of SB1. There are other funds that are available in the state, but quite frankly, the federal government needs to step up because there is not enough money for transit operations anywhere. It is existential that the federal government contributes to supporting the level of transit operations needed. And I think APTA put it at 32 billion just to revive and restore transit. And I will tell you, as a Californian, I am very concerned about February when the rent comes due for months and months, and people are having to make decisions about whether they have a car or whether they have food or whether they have education or a house. We are going to have more and more people want to use the transit system just at the time that transit is scraping by. So as soon as we vote in November, the next thing we should be doing is talking to our federal officials about how important it is to have a transit system that is fully funded and is frankly going to meet, I think, over the demand that we've seen previously, because more and more people are going to want to use transit because it's cleaner and more efficient, but also may need to use transit because that's the only way their budgets are going to make sense. I also would say that we need to look at some things we could do immediately that the CTC has recommended, like creating a network of express lanes that are essentially well-funded bus-only lanes, and to look at how we can have net toll revenues then continue to fund active transportation, like we fund the Metro Bike Share and other things, because it's so important that we have not only accessible money, but money that has fewer strings attached to it. And I would also say that we've got to focus with Caltrans on creating projects that are those great shop projects that are also complete streets, because we are seeing great projects that also have bike lanes, that also have active transportation components, along with freeway investments. Roadway funding is not only roadway, but it can be a lot of other things. But the very primary thing we need to do is get with our federal partners and get that operational money in place, because without it, this is a very existential moment. And if we're not paying attention to that, it's shame on us, because we have a lot of money for infrastructure, but not enough for operations. And we've got to change that immediately.
And I completely agree with what my colleagues on the panel have said. One thing I will just throw in there, which is not really an answer, but maybe it raises something else to think about, which is that, and Hillary and Therese were talking a lot about transit funding for very obvious reasons. And transit funding is much more dependent on things like the sales tax in California, which are extremely sensitive to the economy. The taxes and fees that I were talking about, which are all collected by the state on vehicles, are less volatile. Like if we look at the last recession, 10 years ago, the sales tax money fell far faster than, say, the miles people were driving and how expensive their new cars were. Now, we have a situation right now where, for the most part, that money collected by those state fees is not spent on public transit. And certainly if you know, there are exceptions, but the great majority of it is for roads, streets, highways. And there are plenty of reasons to think that we still need that revenue and should, you know, the needs are very great in our road system. But maybe as we have to rethink a lot of things, at least something I think we should think about. I don't know what the right decision is. Do we want to start spending more of that somewhat more stable and predictable revenue stream for transit, and in particular transit operations? And again, I don't know if that's the right decision or not, but I think it's important to put on the table. And I'll just end by saying I've done an annual series of surveys. These are national surveys asking people about raising the federal gas tax. And for a number of years, one question we've asked is, would you support spending some, not all, of course, but some gas tax revenue on public transit? And a clear majority does support that. So I think there's reason to think that this is something that the public might understand and see value in.
And if I'm just so I'm very transparent. If you see my face make an expression, it's mostly because my kids are literally running back and forth my hallway, you know? And I'm just like, yeah. So anyways, that's just, this is COVID life, right? Like if you have small children, they are running around and screaming and you're trying to focus and be present. Thank you guys for those answers. And I think that the next question I want to ask, I think really kind of pulls into some of the intersectionality that we've already been talking about. And when I'm using that term, I'm talking about the intersection, I think, and Hillary brought this up around, we're talking about, you know, when the rent gets due in February, right? Like, and the housing part of this piece of it. And I think, you know, as Reese was talking about, who are we talking about when we say, talking about transportation finance, for who? That is a really big question. And Asha's point around, well, wait, we do have some of these more stable funding sources that aren't so volatile and aren't so aggressive. What does it look like to redirect some of those? So this question, I think, kind of falls in line and really builds on that. And this is my last question. It really is around, you know, and I think I've heard, you know, from our previous panel, but just we've heard overall, like the idea and the need for like a reparation style, like infrastructure package that really starts to address the past harms and injustices that we've seen, particularly for Black, Indigenous, people of color, for those communities. And as we're thinking about, right, like we're thinking about COVID, the pandemic, we're thinking about climate, we're thinking about, you know, housing and how connected it is to transportation. Big question is, if we do start to think about like reparations, which I know there's already a task force that's tasked at looking at this, what does that look like and mean for transportation, especially as we've already talked about, you know, some of the funding sources and the sales taxes. I'm gonna ask though that everybody does this in terms of a lightning round. So I'm only gonna give folks 2 minutes just because we have some really great questions in the Q&A and I wanna make sure we get to it. So I'm gonna give you guys 2 minutes and then I'll put my finger up basically when you guys are done so we can keep moving and get to those questions in the Q&A. And I will start with Hillary, since I know that there's stuff in the legislature that might connect to the CTC, and then I'll let you popcorn to Therese and then we'll end again with Asha.
Yeah, I think reparations-based financing for us is exactly what we're looking at in terms of the listening sessions. I think we also have a good opportunity in November as we're working with CARB. We have a joint meeting with CARB and the Housing and Community Development to look at these co-benefits and co-restoration reparations about access to housing ownership, access to affordable housing, access to healthy communities, and electric vehicles. We also want to look at this legislation because this is very important and we don't want to get ahead of the legislature, but we want to feed into the legislature's analysis of what a reparations package looks like. And I think we also have to look at how we hold the private sector accountable for the things that are going to be, I think one of the biggest issues is, where are we holding the banks accountable for decades of redlining? Where are we holding the other elements of our society accountable for the harms that also need reparations. And so we're looking forward to being part of the transportation component of that. It has a broadband component, it has an EV infrastructure component, but I think it all matters. And I would again say that we need to look at EIFDs and tax increment financing to make sure that any money that's generated also gets to stay within the community and get recycled on behalf of the community, because I think that's very important. And it was how we eradicated blight and fixed reparations in communities that were suffering in previous decades.
Awesome. Thanks, Hillary. And then I think, did you want to talk about, you have 1 minute left, so if you want to talk about anything about the CTC efforts on listening sessions, feel free to.
Sure. We are going to have 6 listening sessions statewide. Well, I mean, however COVID will let us do that, but we're going to have 6 listening sessions. And again, these listening sessions are not timed. They are part of the conversation about what the needs are, what is missing, where are the disparities, because we want the legislature to be part of this conversation. We also need to realize that SB1 isn't the only source of funding for transportation in the state. Where can we start moving our other dollars to fill out what SB1 can do so that we can support immediate reparations and resuscitation of communities that have been suffering? And so we see this opportunity for these listening sessions, and the reason why we're so gratified that CalSTA and Caltrans are working with us is because this is not bounded by any one funding source. This is bounded only by how can we bring the state and all of its powers and funding sources to bear to address inequities and make sure that we create permanent opportunities to get out of inequitable situations. And again, create wealth, not just income, and to make sure that the improvements in communities are permanent.
Thank you, Hillary, so much. Okay, so we're gonna go to Therese, and I realized I did a thumbs up and I meant to do the 2 fingers. So I'll just say the thumbs up is when we're out of time.
Thank you.
Great, and I'll be targeting quick because I know there's amazing questions out there we also want to get to. You know, when we think about reparations and investing in communities, not just with a forward look, but redressing huge gaps of investment, sometimes over generations. I think one of the really interesting challenges for us as transportation planners and funders and whatnot is how we define community. Because we can define it as a very locational, spatial place, right? Parts of our cities and increasingly in our suburbs or in our rural areas, where you can literally define a boundary. You know, we're going to put infrastructure in this place. But we also, I think, need to talk about underserved populations who, you know, again, historically, because it's race, class, you know, whatever the factors are, age, maybe don't live necessarily in a single place, but particularly for affordability, their ability to use a system or participate in a different way or access different levels of mobility and travel are independent of location, but more due to factors that they experience, you know, that they have as people. And so both of those factors need to be taken into account, I believe, when we speak to the larger notion of repairing injury done to communities. And so that actually in transportation becomes a really, I think, important distinction, but one that we need to keep mindful of in both places. The other thing I wanted to point out is when we think about redressing injury of the past, if the solutions are going forward, we need to make sure that we're making sure that the rapidly changing transportation environment and opportunities attached to that, electric vehicles, broadband access, all of those new things are deliberately, intentionally, we are asking, how do we make these new opportunities and new solutions and new technologies available to those who most need them. Not just giving them back what they missed out 20 years ago, but what's going to be happening 20 years in the future. And so I just think those are important dimensions to your question, Chanel, as we think about what really infrastructure and service reparation would look like in transportation.
Wow, these are big questions, big thoughts. Asha, you're going to end us, and I'll give you that same 2 minutes.
Thank you. So just to add, and I think that Therese and Hurley have given us a lot to think about in terms of how we spend the money. What is it used for? But I would just throw into the mix, there's also the question of how we raise whatever money is spent. And some, as I've already alluded, taxes and fees, this is race agnostic, but are more, harder to pay for lower income populations. And so we also may want to think about, as we move forward, that, and then also some of the taxes, and every tax and fee we impose influences behavior, regardless of whether we want to think of ourselves as social engineers or we don't. We still have that impact, and even not charging a fee also influences behavior. So, there are some taxes and fees that, for example, might encourage people to transition faster to lower emitting, less polluting vehicles. And the benefits of that could be, particularly felt in some historically disadvantaged communities that have lots of trucks and freeways running through them, and therefore are, suffering more directly from pollution. So again, there are different ways that we can perhaps think strategically about how we raise money that will help achieve these equity goals.
Thank you so much. And with that said, Jacob, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know we already have folks in the queue.
Great, thank you so much for this incredible discussion. Our first question comes from Deborah Murphy.
You need to get off mute.
Must have done it twice. Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. Hillary, you mentioned how the active transportation program had 5 times the applications as there is funding for. So how can we shift the dollars from other sources, that money that's going to other programs like highway, for example, which gets the bulk of our money, to active transportation, because that impacts everybody. Everybody walks, a lot of people bike, there are a lot of, transit riders out there. Really, the highway money is, very focused on car stuff. Sure, a bus might ride on a highway, but we need to get more money there. I work on a lot of ETP grant applications, and people are, wanting to get this funding, and it's super competitive. So obviously, we need more.
Yes. Deborah, you're right. The thing is that this is written in statute, and so we really need to work with the legislature if there are ways that we can make some changes. But in the meantime, I will say, again, the SHOP program is not only roads. It does fund bike lanes, it funds, and I think really it's only about how creative the projects can be that come back to us. And so I really think that working with Caltrans, and Caltrans has been wonderful about hearing about what needs to be included in and around freeway access, bike lanes that cross freeways, and go underpasses. I think there are a lot of opportunities that we can look at now. And again, I would just say we're not the only funds, but I would also say that one of the reasons that we want to see an express lanes network broadened is because it gives us an opportunity to also create managed lanes, pricing, really good buses, but net toll revenues that can go towards more active transportation. We really want to see more cap and trade dollars and others. And let's not forget that the money that's going to go into roads and help freight, that's helping us raise more sales tax dollars, which then can go back to the metros and the MTCs towards active transportation funds there. So we're constantly thinking about how we can have these dollars flow and get back to bikes and active transportation as well, while also being very careful about working within the statute, because we know we've had to beat back a recall of SB1 with Prop 6. There are lots of people that would like to tie these funds up in court. And we are in existential moments about where funds are coming from. And we want to make sure we're constantly being able to use them where they're needed. I will say to Asha's point about going to cleaner transportation, you know, Phil Washington, CEO of Metro, talks about how a regular bus is 500,000 and a zero emission bus is 1.3 million. We need to think about how we are going to be raising additional money and needing to spend additional money in order to have that kind of new service. And I think it's incumbent upon us, Deborah, to your point about bike and PED, that even with the Metro bike share, we need to have better broadband. We need to have better EV infrastructure, because people, even to access some of these systems, need to have services that are not always in every community equitably. So we're constantly working on that. And Deborah, I just want to thank you for your personal investment in making sure that most of the great bike projects that we have in our county have really been done somewhere by you somehow.
Happy to do that, serve our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then Jacob, is there someone else in the queue? It looks like it may be Sarah. Is that right?
Oh, I will get Sarah on in a second, but first we have a question from Zoe Unruh.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for the really excellent panel. I had a question for Dr. Agrawal. Your scenario 6 realizes many of the state's current goals, including BMT reduction and electric vehicle adoption. But and I'm really excited to dive into more of those slides a little bit when I have some time. But it looks like it erodes the state's revenues to address transportation infrastructure and things like state of good repair, which we already are running such a huge deficit on. So I know there are also discussions around a transition from a gas tax to a road charge, but obviously in such a scenario that wouldn't really address that revenue shortfall. So what are some other things we could be thinking about as far as increasing revenue under that type of scenario?
Thank you, Zoe, for that question. Because you're right, you know, so many of our important objectives about clean air and frankly, reducing the amount of money the public potentially has to spend owning cars and driving long distances, given the current way we fund transportation, suggests falling revenues, particularly if we move quickly away from gas vehicles, which looks like right now our governor is interested in supporting. But the mileage fee, the interesting sort of thing about that is you can set it at whatever rate you want. So and I just threw out at the very end the example, if we had the number of vehicles and the percentage of the fleet that's electric and this pretty substantial per capita annual miles driven drop, that's our low carbon scenario. But we wanted to raise that higher amount of revenue, for example, our scenario 6, we could eliminate the gas excise tax and the diesel tax paid by light duty vehicles and both of those registration fees. And at 3.3 cents per mile, we would raise that higher amount of overall revenue. And I mean, I don't know that we would, but it could be 6 cents a mile or 8 cents a mile, or maybe we did something like we made it 5 cents a mile, but then we had a lifeline per mile rate for low income households equivalent to what we offer, sort of lifeline utility rates for people who are struggling economically. So that's one thing. So in theory, a mileage fee could raise all the revenue we want. But you're right. It's really important to think about other sources of funding. And I mean, it could be things like income taxes, business tax revenues. It could be right now the revenue from the cap and trade program is not performing as highly as had been hoped. But if that comes back, there's that revenue. But that brings us back to just the sort of strategic point that some revenues are dedicated by law for transportation, at least right now, and then other revenues are not. And there are a whole lot of other incredibly important things to spend that money on. And Therese has mentioned, housing, schools, public health. So it may be strategic to try to focus on continuing to generate revenue from these funds that are restricted for transportation. And then there's also some potential benefit for equity and other reasons that it's user fee. If I sit at home and I don't drive anywhere, then I don't have to pay a gas tax, whereas I do pay a sales tax, no matter how little or much I travel.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you said about kind of a low income consideration for a mileage based fee, because obviously you have location decisions being made based on income levels and what's affordable, and you have lots of people moving further out and farther away from their jobs. So we wouldn't want to obviously, as we're thinking about these new choices and making these decisions with equity in mind, we wouldn't want to disadvantage those lower income folks.
And thank you so much, Zoe. And I think I'm going to move us to the next question. And I think the one that I want to go to is I'm going to go to Sarah's, and it's really, I think, on this topic as well. And I think, unfortunately, she had to drop off, but she asked basically, we depend on cars and driving to fund transit operations, fuel taxes, as we just discussed. That's not sustainable given kind of where we're moving towards with electric vehicles, for reducing driving overall. And so what is a different vision for operational funding that is equitable and supports the level of service that we need to provide?
Can I start with just a really quick answer and then turn it over to Therese and Hillary, which is that
I was gonna say, like, really quickly, like, let's do it like really quickly, because I know that Dr. Shoup also has a question. I'm hoping we can get to it. So quick would be great for everyone.
So I would say that even if driving rates plummet, even if our vehicle fleet shrinks, we could set per mile tax rates, per gallon tax rates, per vehicle tax rates high enough to raise all the revenue we want. So there's no inherent reason, even if driving halved, for example, that we couldn't still raise the revenue. So I'll stop there.
And then Therese, and then Hillary, and let's try to make it as quickly short so we can get to Dr. Shoup's question if possible.
Yeah, I and maybe just given your challenge, you don't all have to answer every question. I think the only thing, my gosh, that I would say is, as Asha was pointing out, in general, this idea of a user-based approach, as long as it was mitigated with a means-based overlay to ensure that the ability to pay for equal access and equal opportunity was built in. I think that's, for the transportation sector, is probably the most sustainable approach, even as we, consider the different modal mix of transportation options that are out there. And that speaks again to the flexibility. In a perfect world, we would have one pot of money that would be sustainable, that would fund all manner of need, as opposed to these silos where it's very modally siloed, and it really creates a rigidity that doesn't get us to what people need at any point of time as quickly as it has. So that flexibility, I think, would also be essential to really improving our environment.
And let's do this. I'm only cutting you off, Hillary, because I realize this question that Dr. Shoup has is directed to you, so you can kind of do for and close us out. So I see Dr. Shoup is on, so I'm going to turn it over to you to ask your question.
Hello. Congratulations on one of the most wonderful Zoom sessions I've ever been on. I have a question for Hillary. That 28 years ago, California adopted its parking cash out law, which requires employers, large employers who subsidize parking, to treat all employees equally. The research on how it works showed that it reduced solo driving, and the benefits mainly went to low-income commuters and to Black commuters and to women. But the state has never enforced the law on all employers that are required to offer parking cash out. Do you think that Washington, D.C. has just adopted an even stronger version of the law based on its equity? Do you think that the current crisis will lead California to move towards enforcing this law?
Yes, I think AB 2548, the Friedman bill that talked about how we can have additional traffic demand management options and work on making sure we have commuter plans for businesses 50 and above, is going to give us some opportunities to look at parking pricing as a way of encouraging people to take transit and a way of addressing some issues related to equity. I also wanted to say that this could be a very important component of a congestion pricing plan or the traffic reduction fee plan, because I think we're going to start looking at areas that are going to have additional opportunities for a fee-based solution that could then fund the very important work that needs to happen for active transportation or EV transit that comes into and out of those communities and can support areas of equity. So I think that what I'm finding in the polling that we're doing as part of Fastlink DTLA is that people do say that parking pricing and the opportunity to use parking cash out would meaningfully move them from driving to transit. And we are looking forward to presenting those findings earlier in the year next year.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome. And I think, yes, we're at 11:26. So I think we're going to close out. I know there's one last question in the Q&A. I want to encourage folks to feel free. One, this is recorded, so we'll be sharing it out later. The slides will come out later as well. And I mean, none of these people are mysteries. You can, I mean, honestly, you can Google all of them and find out ways to connect with them. And I hope you do, because I just honestly being on this panel with all these amazing women, just dropping knowledge. I mean, especially as someone that is been in this space for a while, but again, like I think just understanding from a practitioner's point of view and from, I think, a state agency point of view and the academic piece and bringing that all together, that is really powerful. And as I mentioned before, the fact that it's all women, I think for me, it's just been a really amazing and affirming. So thank you guys all so much. I want to thank WSP for sponsoring this session as well. And I want to just thank UCLA and Lake Arrowhead Symposium. They've done an amazing job, in my opinion, of just pivoting very quickly in light of COVID and also just in light of, I think, what happened last year and making sure that these panels were diverse, and I think there are ways for people to engage. So I think a huge shout out to the folks at UCLA, Lake Arrowhead Symposium. And I also want to let folks know that we're going to be coming back at 1:30, and you see it on the slide for Transit Path to Recovery. We already were talking about transit a little bit in this session, so I hope you guys can make it. I'm going to try to be there with my kids, so I'm excited. So thank you guys again, and we will talk to you guys later. Bye all.
John is moderating.